In the next hour on Trial Story,
He looked me in the eyes, pointed his gun at me.
Shot me 5 times.
more than a dozen people say Colin Ferguson shot them at point-blank range on a crowded commuter train.
No mystery about this case.
But Ferguson says he's innocent, and he decides to act as his own attorney.
My constitutional right.
In the next hour on Trial Story, from opening statements to the verdict, murder on the 533, the trial of Colin Ferguson.
This is a case of stereotype victimization of a black man.
A crowded Long Island Railroad commuter train was just pulling into the Merillon Avenue station in Garden City, Long Island on December 7, 1993, when passengers were disturbed by loud sounds.
I just thought there were rocks being thrown at the train.
Passengers inside the third car watched with horror as a black man, later identified as Colin Ferguson, started shooting his way up and down the aisle.
He was pointing into the seats, sometimes with one hand, sometimes with 2 hands.
He looked me dead in the eye and pointed the gun, and with the most serious look I have ever seen on anyone's face, he shot me in the chest.
And I can hear him say, "You're going to get it, you're going to get it."
The gunman fired more than 30 rounds, many at point-blank range. He was reloading his gun when commuters tackled him to the ground.
The gunman was subdued by passengers on the train. The information we have at this time is that at least 3 people and possibly more assisted in apprehending him.
I don't know.
6 passengers were dead. 19 others sustained serious injury. Police charged Colin Ferguson with 93 counts of murder, attempted murder, assault, and related felonies. Though more than 50 eyewitnesses identified him as the gunman, Ferguson says he was asleep on the train when the shooting began. But police found rambling, hate-filled notes in Ferguson's pocket that indicated Ferguson had, in fact, planned the shooting.
That'd be crazy to be shooting up a whole train.
Something went wrong with Colin, and something is wrong with him.
Ferguson's own legal advisor, Alton Rose, believes his client is mentally unstable. But Ferguson, who insists he had nothing to do with the shootings, decides not to pursue an insanity defense.
People versus Colin Ferguson, indictment 86739.
Against Rose's advice, Ferguson also decides to represent himself at trial.
As far as I'm concerned, a man who seeks to represent himself is a fool for a client.
Ferguson's decision to act as his own lawyer produced unusual exchanges in court.
The only time you have seen the suspect is on TV. Am I correct?
I saw you shoot me, and I've seen you on TV.
Many of the shooting victims say they found it cathartic to face Ferguson in court.
You are nothing, and you are entitled to nothing.
You are nothing but a joker.
I don't think that the founding fathers had that type of spectacle in mind when they say that you had the right to confront your accuser.
Rose, along with prosecutor George Peck and Judge Donald Belfie, went out of his way to safeguard Ferguson's right to represent himself.
A person has the absolute right to defend himself.
Many observers nonetheless found it disturbing to watch Colin Ferguson, a man of questionable sanity and no legal training, hold forth in court.
I can't believe that a man who has done this has the nerve to go through this process. It absolutely appalls me.
In New York, as in most states, a defendant can act as his own lawyer so long as he is found competent to stand trial. A person is deemed competent if 1, he understands the proceedings against him, and 2, can assist with his defense. Colin Ferguson passed this test. Did Ferguson proceed to make a mockery of the criminal justice system? Or is the trial of Colin Ferguson an example of how far courts will go to safeguard the right to represent oneself at trial and other important constitutional rights? In the next hour, we'll see what happens when a seemingly mad man decides to defend himself against murder charges.
Other than being intelligent and articulate, he's very proud.
A native of Jamaica, Ferguson grew up amid great wealth. The young man Ferguson family servants called Mr. Cullen started to snap after his father died in a car crash. Ferguson was 20 at the time. At 24, Ferguson left for America. He held a series of odd jobs and then enrolled at Adelphi University in Long Island. He impressed fellow workers and students with his bigotry, paranoia, and abusive language. In the spring of 1993, Ferguson flew to California, where he purchased a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. The same pistol was introduced 10 months later at Ferguson's murder trial.
Let the record reflect the jury is all present. The people ready to proceed?
Yes.
Prosecutor George Peck begins by reciting the charges against Colin Ferguson.
First count, intentional murder, victim Dennis McCarthy. Fifth count, intentional murder, the victim Richard Nettleton. The 11th count, intentional murder, the victim Amy Federici. 48th count, Jill Michael. 2 shots in the head. 68th count, reckless endangerment. Ladies and gentlemen, there's no mystery about this case. Within the first 5 or 6 witnesses, you're going to see enough to know that this man was the shooter.
It's Mr. Peck reading from an accusatory instrument called an indictment. This is simply an instrument which brings a defendant into court to face trial. It is not in any way an admission of guilt by a defendant. It is not in any way a confirmation of guilt by defendant, but it is simply charges that are brought against a defendant by way of a grand jury.
Lucid one moment, utterly off the wall the next, Ferguson's opening statement gives jurors a taste of what is to come.
There were 93 counts to that indictment. 93 counts, only because it matches the year 1993. Had it been 1925, it would have been 25 counts.
Referring to himself in the third person, as he will throughout the trial, Ferguson introduces the defense theory of the case.
The evidence will show that Colin Ferguson was in fact a well-meaning passenger on the train, and also a well-meaning passenger transporting to safe haven a firearm, which in fact he purchased legally. At the time that Mr. Ferguson was on the train, like any other passenger, he dozed off, having the weapon in a bag. At that point, someone opened the bag, took the weapon out of the bag, and proceeded to shoot. I expect that after you have deliberated and carefully weighed the evidence in this case, you will return the only possible verdict. That is a verdict of not guilty. I thank you very much.
The state calls its first witness.
Detective Andrew Roderick, R-O-D-E-R-I-C-K.
A Long Island Railroad policeman, Detective Roderick went to the Merillon Avenue station to pick up his wife. He knew right away something was wrong.
I asked numerous people what was going on, and they told me there was a man with a gun, and he was in the third car, and he had just shot a whole bunch of people.
Detective Roderick says he drove to the end of the station and ran on board the train.
There were bodies laying in the vestibule area, also in the aisleway itself. 2 females. There were shell casings laying all over the place.
Did you smell anything?
Yes, I smelled gunpowder, and I also smelled the smell of human blood.
The witness saw that 3 commuters had subdued a man later identified as Colin Ferguson. Roderick handcuffed the suspect and placed him under arrest.
I told him, do not move, as I was attempting to, pull his arms back and put the handcuffs on. Don't move. He told me, I'm not going anywhere. Yeah, I did it.
Ferguson uses his cross-examination to advance the theory that his arrest was racially motivated.
Would you have acted differently if a white person was being held down by 3 black men?
Objection. This is
Sustained.
The state's next witness, Detective Charles Pacini, spoke to the defendant while he was being held in the back seat of a police vehicle.
I asked him if he had any more guns or weapons or anything on him. At that time, Mr. Ferguson told me, "No, you have my gun up in front."
Detective Brian Parpan introduces photos of the bodies found on the train and the boxes containing 50 rounds of full metal ammunition and 9 rounds of black Talon ammunition found in the blue bag Ferguson had on the train. On cross-examination, Ferguson points out that the photos say nothing about the perpetrator.
Can you look at these photographs and see a suspect in there?
They're photographs of evidence. The evidence points to a specific individual. That's what you asked. From the photographs, of course not.
Do these, okay, withdrawn. Do these photographs show a suspect?
No, they don't.
The testimony of the next witness, Detective Donald Daly, helps advance the state's contention that the Long Island Railroad shooting was the premeditated work of a cold-blooded killer. For starters, Daly says Ferguson had practiced shooting.
He said that while he had the gun in his apartment, he would load it and unload it, and he would pull the trigger.
Daly also tells jurors about the notes found in Ferguson's pockets when he was arrested. The notes set forth Ferguson's apparent reasons for shooting up the train.
The racism of Governor Cuomo's staff and the executive chamber, the racism of the lieutenant governor's staff, the corrupt black attorneys who not only refused to help me, but tried to steal my car. He spoke about the civil rights leaders here, the sloppy running of the number 2 train. It is racism by Caucasians. He talks about those filthy swines that live at 226 Martin Street, his own address.
The state calls its most dramatic witnesses, the commuters, who say Colin Ferguson shot them, many at point-blank range. When we come back.
After what I saw on that train, I think he's probably the worst person on earth.
I think he's a sick man. I'd like to see him get the death penalty, really.
After days of testimony, the first of the many victims of the Long Island Railroad shooting have a chance to face the man they say attacked them.
Marianne Phillips.
Phillips, the first person shot, describes what happened after the train left the New Hyde Park station.
I was sitting there reading the newspaper, literally in my own little world, kind of not seeing the outside world at all. Through my peripheral vision, I could see someone stand up directly next to me, and it made me turn to that person and look at them, away from my newspaper. And as I turned, I saw Mr. Colin Ferguson.
Now, at that time, what did he do?
He looked me dead in the eye and pointed the gun, and with the most serious look I have ever seen on anyone's face, he shot me in the chest. I felt the bullet come over here, over my left breast, exited right here, and I know that's where it is because that's where my scar is. The same bullet re-entered my arm about here, shattered all of my arm into almost granules of sand, and the bullet wound up right down here.
After she was shot, Phillips says she closed her eyes and pretended to be dead so Ferguson wouldn't shoot her again.
Because I was afraid Mr. Ferguson would see me alive.
On cross-examination, Ferguson suggests the witness mistakenly identified him as her assailant.
Would you say the description you gave of 5'10", 5'11 inches tall, stocky build, short here, in his 30s could fit just about any person?
Yes. Sustained.
It was your statement that you played dead?
Yes.
And did that involve closing your eyes?
Yes, it did.
So you wanted the person who was doing the shooting to think that you were dead?
Yes, I didn't want you to shoot me again.
So you were not able to see anything, am I correct? Because your eyes were closed.
After being shot, I saw you shoot me.
Frank Barber, Robert Giuliano, Kevin Zaleski, Lisa Combati, John Forney, Jill Michael, Mark Heaney, John Aspel, and Elizabeth Aviles were shot on the train too. They supplied chillingly similar testimony about the rampage.
I heard popping sounds.
So I thought that some kids had thrown firecrackers into the train.
I saw the shooter walking up the aisle towards me, looking into seats with his right hand extended.
He looked me in the eyes, square in the face. I'm looking at you right now. And he pointed his gun at me.
He had the gun pointed at me. He then opened fire on me.
A bullet entered my left hand across the palm, came through my left thumb, shattering the thumb, entered my neck, and proceeded up into my mouth where it lodged in my tongue. I just kind of was frantic, and I stated, I have 7 children. I can't die in this train.
He shot me 5 times. I was bleeding pretty bad from both my arms, and they tied tourniquets on my arms to try and slow the blood down.
I was shot in the forehead.
The bullet, when it entered me and it went off my rib.
I felt a bullet hit me in the left buttock area.
Oh, I was shot 2 times or 3 times. They didn't know really how many at the time, but things go through your head, you know. You just had the sweats and burning and sort of like that. I just didn't know. I mean, you get shot with a gun, I thought, chances are you don't make it.
I had an entrance and an exit wound to my right shoulder.
Robert Giuliano, Mark Heaney, Kevin Zaleski, and Lisa Combati, who was 7 months pregnant at the time of the shooting, watched with horror as passengers died around them.
There was a gentleman by the window who was unconscious at that point. That was Jim Garicki.
I saw another man get shot, I think, in these seats here. There was blood all over the window. His head had basically exploded onto the window.
Robert Giuliano and Lisa Combati both say they are haunted by Maria Magtoto's death.
The back of her head or her head, it exploded. I saw her on the floor in front of me, blood all over.
That was a vision that haunted me for weeks and weeks. Just at what a beautiful face she was, and I just knew that she was dead.
When I went home that night, I told my wife after I saw it, this beautiful girl with an angelic face came on the train, and 2 minutes later, she was dead at my feet. Her blood was on my pants.
Kevin McCarthy's tale has particular poignance.
I remember leaving Penn Station and then hearing an undistinguished sound and hearing people talk next to me about me sliding my hand along the bar that was in front of my seat.
The next thing McCarthy remembers was waking up in a hospital.
Did you lose part of your brain cells?
Yes, I lost an estimated 10% of my brain.
What about your skull?
A portion of my skull was replaced by a titanium mesh plate.
McCarthy is partially paralyzed as a result of his injuries. He was on the train with his father, Dennis McCarthy. The elder McCarthy didn't make it off the train alive. None of the victims had any trouble identifying the gunman.
Do you recognize that person who saw the shooting in courtroom today?
Yes, I do.
He's the gentleman in the brown jacket at the second table.
Oh, he's the fellow with the brown jacket and a brown tie.
That individual right there.
Be more specific.
There are 2 individuals sitting at the table behind Detective Parpan. It's the one on the left with the brown suit on.
The gentleman sitting at the defense table in the center, brown jacket.
Mr. Ferguson.
Ferguson cross-examines each of the witnesses in turn. Often it is difficult to tell what Ferguson has in mind.
And is it your testimony that blood was on your foot?
Yes.
And was it your testimony that it was Maria Magtoto's blood?
That's correct.
Did you see when that blood splashed on your foot?
Did I see when it splashed?
Yes.
No, I didn't see when it splashed, no.
And it's your testimony that you were shot?
Yes.
During his cross-examination of Kevin Zaleski, Ferguson zeroes in on Zaleski's response to the pop sounds he heard on the train.
And it is your testimony on oath now that you looked when you heard this pop?
Yes.
And this was after the first pop, am I correct?
Yeah, as soon as I heard the noise, I turned in the direction of the noise.
In an apparent effort to discredit the witness, Ferguson reads from the statement Zaleski gave the grand jury.
At first, I didn't know what the noises were. But then I realized it was gunshots. I just fell to the floor. Do you remember?
Yes.
So you're lying, am I correct, Mr. Zaleski?
No, sir. No. I turned. I saw you with the gun. I heard the gunshots. I realized that it was a gun, and then I got on the floor.
Ferguson recovers his cool a moment later with a series of questions designed to show that Zaleski had a lot on his mind at the time of the shooting, and so cannot be trusted to have given police a reliable description of the shooter.
Were you concerned for your safety, Mr. Zaleski?
Absolutely.
Did you take measures at any time to protect yourself?
Yes.
And would you say that you were in shock?
I was very scared.
And am I correct that, would it be fair to say that your first concern was to get out of the way? Get away from this sound?
Yes.
While cross-examining Mark Heaney, Ferguson suggests the witness identified him after he'd heard he'd been charged in connection with shooting up the train.
When you got home, did you watch TV?
No.
Did your family speak to you about the incident on the train?
Of course they did.
So you were acquainted with the incident on the train, am I correct?
I was on the train. I saw what happened on the train.
At
so
home?
I was acquainted with it very, very well.
Mr. Forney, did the attorneys Lambert and Weiss mean anything to you?
Yes, they do.
And is it true that you have filed a $20 million lawsuit against defendant Ferguson?
Yes, it is.
Ferguson suggests Forney can't be trusted since he has a vested interest in the trial. He follows up with a series of seemingly unrelated questions.
Is it your testimony that you were shot in the face?
Yes.
Is there a scar to indicate that?
Yes, there is. It's right here.
Indicating on the left cheek.
And it is still your testimony that you felt no pain?
That's right.
With Kevin McCarthy, Ferguson is quick and to the point.
If you could just, if possible, articulate for the jury if there is any way whatsoever you can assist them in positively identifying the shooter on the train.
No, I did not see the person that shot me.
No further questions, Judge.
Ferguson seems to try at least one witness's patience.
Did there come a time when you heard a pop?
Yeah, when you got up out of your
Judge,
seat,
who did you see shot first?
I saw you shoot someone to the north side of the train, which is your left.
Is it your testimony under Mr. Peck's questioning that you saw no one shot?
I saw you shooting everyone on the train, okay?
This was important for me to do.
It was good to get in there and definitely let him know that I saw you do this.
The greatest part of my life in this past year, to look him in the eyes again, under my terms. And I was in control of it.
It's good for me to do it.
I got him nervous this time, and he was the one who was nervous. And I'm so happy.
I am proceeding according to my constitutional right to defend myself.
Ferguson did not immediately avail himself of that right. Civil rights lawyers William Kunstler and Ronald Kuby stepped forth to represent Ferguson shortly after the shooting on the train.
The defense in Colin Ferguson's case was always the insanity defense.
But Kunstler and Kuby added a racial twist.
You had a man with an unstable psyche and a pre-existing mental illness who was repeatedly exposed to racism day in, day out, year after year, and that finally broke him. And in that moment of madness, in that black rage, he went out and massacred that train full of people.
Pollsters found this defense, quickly dubbed the Black Rage defense, made sense to 45% of whites and 60% of blacks polled. But Ferguson decided he was not an appropriate candidate for any kind of insanity defense.
Colin Ferguson ultimately rejected the insanity defense because Colin Ferguson was convinced that he wasn't insane. Everybody else was crazy, not Colin Ferguson.
Ferguson fired Kunstler and Kuby after they urged the court to reevaluate his competency for trial. Ferguson decides he'll represent himself at trial.
I mean, the problem in this case wasn't that Colin Ferguson was representing himself. The problem in the case is that Colin Ferguson was a delusional psychotic, and his defense was a product of mental illness, his arguments were a product of mental illness, and ultimately the whole trial became a product of the intersection of Colin Ferguson's mental illness and the prosecutor's own ambition.
Prosecutor George Peck, for whatever reason, did insist Ferguson was a sane man who should be brought to trial. Peck, who is now a judge in Nassau County, chose not to speak with Court TV. Initially, Kunstler and Kuby act as Ferguson's in-court advisors, as did Dennis Lemke, Alton Rose, and Terry Edwards. Kuby, Kunstler, and Lemke stopped this practice shortly after trial began. Though Edwards and Rose continued to advise Ferguson throughout the trial, Ferguson remains in charge of his defense.
Mr. Peck, your next witness, please.
My name is George Kevin Blum, B-L-U-M.
Blum, too, was on the train during the shooting rampage on December 7th, 1993.
I was completely scared out of my wits. The only thoughts that were going through my mind at the time were that I was going to be shot, that this wasn't fair to my wife and to my children, and that it just doesn't happen this way. You just don't leave work in the morning and get shot on a train and never make it home to say goodbye to anybody.
Blum says Ferguson stopped shooting for an instant. Blum acted quickly.
What I saw was Mr. Ferguson drop the gun that he had just fired. I threw down my bag, kept going towards him, grabbed him by the chest. He said, "I will not resist."
Blum tackled the gunman and pinned him against a seat. He says he kept him there with his knee in Ferguson's groin and his arm in Ferguson's throat until police arrived.
As I was on top of him, he said, "You're hurting me. Please don't hurt me." A very bad thing has happened here. In the morning, this will all be over.
Cross-examination, Mr. Ferguson.
Is it your testimony on the cross-examination by Mr. Peck that the suspect said, a terrible thing has happened, and that it will be all over in the morning?
I believe I said that, yes.
So is it your testimony that the suspect was traumatized, that it was a nightmare for him?
Sustained.
Would your testimony be that the suspect could not believe that what happened happened?
Objection. Sustained.
Once again, it is difficult to determine what Ferguson is getting at.
Michael D. O'Connor, Jr., O''C-O-N-N-O-R.
Thank you.
O'Connor and the next witness, Mark McEntee, helped subdue Ferguson.
We wrestled him into one of the seats over here. We got him down, pinned down. I think Kevin was on his chest. He yelled, "Don't hurt me," a couple other things. And that was it.
An appreciative public thanked McEntee, Blum, and O'Connor for preventing further carnage on the train.
We met with the president a few weeks later.
Did you receive anything from President Clinton?
Cufflinks and M&Ms.
This is not the last we'll hear of President Clinton's involvement in the events surrounding the shooting on board the Long Island Railroad.
My name is Gerard Catanese. The last name is C-A-T-A-N-E-S-E.
The state calls a series of doctors and law enforcement officials to help seal its case against Colin Ferguson.
I'm a forensic pathologist.
Dr. Catanese autopsied two of the commuters shot on board the Long Island Railroad.
Can you form an opinion within a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to the cause of death of Amy Federici?
I can.
What was that opinion, please?
The cause of death was the gunshot wound to her neck, which perforated her vertebral artery.
Dr. Michael DiMartino autopsied Dennis McCarthy, 52, who was traveling home from work with his son Kevin at the time of the shooting.
He died as a result of that gunshot wound to the head that perforated his brain and fractured his skull.
The pathologist's testimony has obvious emotional impact. But as Ferguson points out during his cross-examination of each pathologist, the doctor's testimony says nothing about the defendant's guilt or innocence.
Dr. Hintonese, the autopsy examination you performed in no way determines the identity of a shooter on the train, am I correct?
That is correct.
And you were not an eyewitness to an incident on the train on December 7, 1993?
No, I was not an eyewitness.
No further questions.
Later, ballistics expert Joseph Eisel shows the jury the gun used to shoot passengers on the Long Island Railroad train. The gun is registered to Colin Ferguson. Eisel studied the bullet fragments taken from the victims and the shell casing scattered across the train floor after the massacre.
It's my opinion, after looking at numerous exhibits over all these years, that these projectiles were fired from this gun to the exclusion of all other guns. That's my opinion.
On cross-examination, Ferguson challenges Eisel's finding.
That is your opinion only, am I correct?
That's correct.
And that is not the opinion of a second ballistics expert that you do not know, am I correct?
A second that I do not know that has not examined the evidence, but three that I do know that have examined the evidence.
Ferguson's challenge on this point isn't entirely sensible, since his theory, as he stated in his opening statement, is that someone took the gun and shot up the train while Ferguson was asleep. The state calls Gary Abendandolo.
Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Detective Abendandolo spoke with Ferguson the night of the killings.
He stated he had been thinking about it for a week or two. I wanted to do it.
Abendandolo's testimony helps prosecutors advance their theory that the Long Island Railroad massacre was the work of a deliberate and cold-blooded killer.
Asked him what the people were doing when he was shooting. What was everybody doing on that train? He said they were running, they were crying, screaming. I asked him, didn't that bother you? He said, I didn't care about it.
On cross-examination, Ferguson suggests Abendandolo went to unusual lengths to get him to talk.
Your service revolver is a 9mm Glock, am I correct?
It's one of several revolvers, weapons that I have.
But you do have a Glock, am I correct?
One of several, yes.
And was that the gun you held to Mr. Ferguson's head and threatened to blow it open?
Could you repeat that?
Was that the same gun you held to Mr. Ferguson's head at headquarters and threatened to blow it open?
At no time did I ever hold a gun to your head.
Ferguson also uses his cross-examination to suggest the government was engaged in a conspiracy against him.
Detective Abendandolo, would it be fair to say that during interrogation at headquarters, you discovered that an agency of the federal government was attempting to frame Mr. Ferguson?
Sustained.
Next, Ferguson says he'd like to subpoena President Clinton.
He has said that President Clinton has had conversations with persons who receive congressional medals coming out of the Long Island Railroad massacre. And therefore these persons might have divulged to President Clinton certain information which they have not told to the court. So he probably wanted to get that type of information from the president. The judge is going to deem it totally irrelevant.
More than a dozen eyewitnesses and numerous experts have said Colin Ferguson shot up the 533 Long Island Railroad train on December 7, 1993.
That being the people's case.
Ferguson's defense when we come back.
The case of the People versus Colin Ferguson, indictment 86739, case on trial.
Mr. Ferguson, it's come to my attention that you have a witness that you would like to put on the stand. Is that correct?
Partly so.
After 9 days, the defense is ready to put on its case, or, as it turns out, partly ready. Ferguson explains that a witness named Mr. Raul Diaz showed up at the courthouse that morning.
The witness said that he was on the train on the night or the day of December 7th, 1993, and in fact was an eyewitness to that particular event, and as such his testimony would, without doubt, point to my innocence.
Ferguson says he needs time to interview the witness. He says he needs time to prepare a closing statement, too. The court is not sympathetic.
Apparent to the court that you had time to have television interviews and tapes with television programs, which I believe could have been well served by you doing the work you intended to do over the weekend, as you indicated to the court.
Outside the courtroom, Raul Diaz treats the assembled reporters to a preview of his would-be testimony.
I am on his side. He, again, is being framed. He's being set up. Mr. Ferguson has been set up by the United States government. He was used, again, as an example for me.
My husband has been kidnapped twice. And the police commissioner has written to us, Janet Reno has written to us, and they're whitewashing a whole internal affairs investigation.
Diaz says he is documenting conspiratorial activities afoot within the United States. He says he's sure the government set Ferguson up in order to frighten Diaz into keeping the lid on these documents.
In 1989, I went to a Yankee baseball game, okay? And I saw on the field a spirit sticking a spear into Don Mattingly's back.
We're probably moving from the sublime to the ridiculous.
Ferguson's advisor is skeptical about the value of Diaz's contribution.
If I was conducting the defense of this case, a spiritualist would not be a necessary part of my defense.
The court preempts all further discussion about the would-be witness and about Ferguson's request for a continuance.
I'll give you 5 minutes. We'll sit here and wait 5 minutes until you get your notes together.
Ferguson comes up with a second would-be witness, one who, once again, requires additional time to prepare. Ferguson explains that the witness, a psychiatrist, will not testify about Ferguson's sanity or competence.
What would be the nature of his testimony if it had nothing to do with an insanity defense?
Well, first of all, it has everything to do with the personality of the defendant as far as his expert opinion as to the potentials of that personality as far as committing a crime.
I'll give you the 5 minutes that you requested to prepare yourself for a summation.
The defense hasn't amounted to much. Ferguson, visibly unnerved by the order to put his summation together, races to assemble his thoughts. At last, the jurors are brought in to hear closing statements.
Mr. Ferguson, do you wish to sum up?
As you can see, I'm a little bit disorganized here, only because it was just about impossible to get everything done as far as formulating my summations.
As he did throughout the trial, Ferguson flips back and forth between lucidity and what sounds like utter madness.
We know the importance of persons who involve themselves in the instruction and the guidance of persons at a very important level of life in our society, a time when there is indecision and indiscretion. There is no greater position, for instance, as a tutor at a high school level. I've always maintained that at that level, which is a lot more important than a college level, in terms of the product that comes out of high schools.
Reminding jurors that he has had a difficult workload, Ferguson ends with a personal appeal.
In the defense, I believe, has done a commendable job. Vindicate Mr. Ferguson. Do not destroy his life more so than it is already destroyed. His life has been extremely difficult. He has suffered. Look at me and see me as a human being and do to me what is needed to put me back in society.
Mr. Peck, closing remarks?
Mr. Ferguson would indicate that this is literally a grand conspiracy participated in by everyone against him, that everyone is against him. In point of fact, he's against the world. The fact of the matter is, he just likes to hear himself talk.
Peck ends his closing statement by mocking the defendant's plea for mercy.
The man hates the world. And he asks you to give him sympathy? God, the suffering he caused.
The jury deliberates for just one day.
Murder in the second degree. What is your verdict?
Guilty.
As to count 3, murder in the second degree. What is your verdict?
Guilty.
As to count 31, attempted murder in the second degree. What is your verdict?
Guilty.
As to count 60, attempted murder in the second degree. What is your verdict?
Guilty.
That's it.
You know, didn't get emotional, but tonight, goddammit, I am very emotional.
Some of the most dramatic moments in the case of State versus Colin Ferguson occur after the verdict, when we come back.
You remember these eyes. You're nothing but a piece of garbage. You're a goddamn animal. 5 minutes, that's all I need with you. 5 minutes.
You have no one to blame but yourself for what a miserable excuse for a human being you are.
I will never understand for the rest of my life why you, Colin Ferguson, murdered my husband as well as the other 5 victims and injured 19 people.
5 weeks after the jury finds Colin Ferguson guilty of murder, attempted murder, and related charges, the parties return to court for sentencing. After prosecutor George Peck asks Judge Belfi to give Ferguson the maximum sentence, life without parole, the victims are given a chance to speak to the defendant. Maria Magtotu's father speaks about his daughter's death.
The greatest injustice is done to our daughter, Marita. She was at the prime of her youth, a brilliant career as a lawyer ahead of her. She is newly married with a vision to build a family surrounded by healthy and cheerful children. She dreamt of becoming a useful member of society and a credit both to the Filipino and American communities. All these have been shattered to pieces by Ferguson.
On December 7th, 1993, I was sentenced to a life of pain and suffering because of this one man's actions. I did not have the luxury of a trial or appeal. The luxury of a trial or appeal. I was convicted and sentenced by a depraved madman with an assault gun.
I do not believe you're crazy, Colin Ferguson. I believe you knew exactly what you were doing that night. But your justice is now about to be served.
You shot me without any provocation. You have accomplished absolutely nothing except you've wreaked havoc on my life. You've wreaked havoc and you've taken away the lives of people who did absolutely nothing to you.
Is there anything the defendant wishes to say?
I am not a smoker. I do not drink alcohol. I do not gamble. I will not get into the whole matter of reading pornography.
Not surprisingly, Ferguson's final thoughts ramble around in many directions. Finally,
Colin Ferguson, in my almost 21 years as a judge, I have never presided over a trial with a more selfish and self-centered defendant than you. That you, Colin Ferguson, are hereby sentenced to an indeterminate term of imprisonment, the maximum of such sentence for each count to be life, and the minimum of such sentence for each count to be 25 years. These 6 sentences are to run consecutively to each other.
the bottom line, Ferguson will spend the rest of his life in prison.
From all reflections, he was unmoved by the sentence.
As far as I'm concerned about Colin Ferguson right now, this is the end. I don't want to hear his name again.
I hope he goes to jail, and that I hope a lot of people torture him.
For Court TV, I'm Terry Moran.